This was the beginning of one of the darkest and most scandalous criminal cases of the second half of the 19th century. The steamship Cephalonia cleared Liverpool on January 28, 1885, bound for Boston with two Englishmen who had never met. Charles Arthur Preller, 32, represented a London textile firm across North America. Hugh Mottram Brooks, 24, called himself Walter Maxwell and claimed to practice medicine. They met at dinner the first night. By the second day, they took meals together. By the third, they shared a cabin. When the Cephalonia docked in Boston 6 days later, hotel staff noted the two as inseparable companions. The letters they exchanged afterward were later described by a St. Louis prosecutor as not fit for publication. Preller had money, mostly $100 bills, and a wide network of business contacts from Montreal to San Francisco. Brooks had studied law in Stockport and claimed to have studied medicine in Manchester, though he held no license and carried no credentials beyond a leather bag of surgical instruments. He traveled under an assumed name for no reason he could later articulate. They planned to sail together to Auckland. Preller would cover the passage. In early February, Preller left for business calls in Philadelphia and Canada. Brooks remained in Boston and ran through what little cash he had. By late March, he'd pawned his watch and departed for St. Louis. Preller wired ahead to confirm Brooks's arrival at the Southern Hotel. The telegram arrived addressed to Dr. Walter H. Lennox Maxwell. Brooks signed the register and took room 144. The Southern Hotel stood at 410 Walnut Street, the city's finest accommodation. Its billiard rooms drew commercial travelers. Its dining room served oysters and champagne. Room 144 sat on the first floor, interior, away from the street. Brooks spent his remaining $60 on cigars and games of billiards. He tried to sell a stereopticon apparatus for traveling money. No buyers appeared. Preller arrived April 3rd. The desk clerk assigned him room 385, a larger suite upstairs. He visited it once to leave his luggage, then returned to Brooks's room and stayed. The hotel staff noticed. Head waiter Henry Arlington later testified they were much remarked about the hotel for their dudish, dandified airs. Bellboy W.I.A. Davidson, 24, described Brooks as very effeminate. The billiard room manager, the cigar stand clerk, and the porters all remembered them. Victorian hotel culture operated on discretion, and the Southern maintained high standards. But the relationship was impossible to miss. The contemporary press would later refer to it in careful language: peculiar, intimate, understood on the premises to have been involved, in the Oscar Wilde sense. Preller paid for the billiards. Preller bought the cigars. Preller displayed a thick roll of bills at the front desk when settling small charges. Brooks watched and waited. On the evening of April 4th, Preller mentioned he might not fund the Auckland passage after all. The exact words were never recorded. Brooks's response came the next day. April 5th fell on Easter Sunday. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Brooks walked 4 blocks to Fernan's drugstore on 5th and Chestnut. He purchased 4 ounces of chloroform, standard anesthetic for minor surgery, available over the counter for 35 cents. 2 hours later, he returned. He'd spilled the first bottle, he explained, and needed 2 more ounces. The druggist Fernan sold him the replacement and made a note of the unusual request. Brooks returned to the hotel carrying 6 ounces of chloroform, enough to anesthetize a patient for hours or to kill a man if applied continuously to a saturated cloth over the nose and mouth. Dinner passed without incident. Afterward, the 2 men retired to room 144. What happened in the next hours was reconstructed later from physical evidence and from a confession Brooks would give to a fellow prisoner. According to that account, Preller complained of a medical issue, pain, perhaps urinary difficulty, described in the euphemistic Victorian language as a private disease. Brooks offered to help. He administered morphine by injection until Preller lost consciousness. Then he tied a cloth over Preller's face, saturated it with chloroform, and held it in place until breathing stopped. Brooks stripped the body. He cut off Preller's mustache with scissors. He carved 2 shallow crosses on the chest. He wrote a note, "So perish all traitors to the great cause," and placed it on the body, staging the scene to resemble a political assassination by the Fenian Brotherhood, the Irish nationalist group then conducting bombing campaigns across Britain. He crammed the corpse into his zinc traveling trunk and bound it with ropes. At 10:15 that night, Brooks appeared in the hotel dining room, visibly drunk. He carried a pistol in his coat. He pulled out a roll of bills, Preller's money, and showed them to head waiter Henry Arlington. If a man committed murder in this country, Brooks asked, and had $600, could he beat the case? Arlington suggested Brooks sleep it off. Brooks laughed and returned to his room. Monday morning, Brooks visited Hickman's barbershop on 5th and Chestnut. The barber, John Armo, shaved off Brooks's full beard. "Could anyone recognize me now?" Brooks asked. Armo, who had no reason to suspect anything, said probably not. From there, Brooks walked to Charles Beeger's trunk shop at 16 South Broadway. He purchased a large canvas trunk and 2 leather straps, paying cash. Beeger's porter, William Train, helped load the new trunk into a hired carriage. Train noticed the trunk was very light. Brooks returned to the Southern Hotel and packed. He summoned Train again, this time to carry the heavy canvas trunk, now loaded with Preller's possessions and his own, downstairs to the carriage. The zinc trunk, containing the body, remained in room 144, along with a smaller bag of odds and ends. Brooks purchased a train ticket to San Francisco under his real name, H.M. Brooks, and departed without checking out. He told the desk clerk that Preller had gone to the country but would return in a few days. The train pulled out of St. Louis that evening. Brooks rode west through Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, and into California. On April 7th, somewhere along the route, he wrote a letter on Southern Hotel stationery to an acquaintance from the Cephalonia voyage, mentioning his plans to continue to San Francisco. He arrived on April 11th and checked into the Palace Hotel as T.C. Dauquier, claiming to be from Paris. The next morning, he purchased a steerage ticket, $90, for the steamship City of Sydney, bound for Auckland. The ship sailed that afternoon. Behind him, in room 144, the zinc trunk sat in the April warmth. By April 14th, the smell had become unbearable. Staff on the first floor complained to management. The manager opened room 144 and found the zinc trunk bound with ropes and straps. He summoned Charles Beeger, who had sold Brooks the canvas trunk, and whose business card sat on the hotel desk. Beeger arrived with tools and cut the bindings. Inside, a human body, blackened and swollen, naked except for a single piece of underwear. The waistband bore the name H.M. Brooks in ink. The mustache had been cut off with scissors. 2 shallow, cross-shaped gashes marked the chest. A note read, "So perish all traitors to the great cause." The police arrived within the hour. Detective Chief John Burke examined the scene and immediately dismissed the political assassination staging. The Fenian Brotherhood did not operate by chloroform or concealment in trunks. The body bore a distinctive scar between the left thumb and forefinger. Within hours, the victim was identified as Charles Arthur Preller, traveling salesman. The suspect? The missing Dr. Maxwell, who had fled without checking out and whose real name was written on the only garment left with the body. April 15th. The St. Louis Daily Globe-Democrat devoted its entire front page to the case under the headline, "Horrible." Burke worked backward through Brooks's movements. Druggist Fernan identified the prescription blanks found in Brooks's abandoned belongings and confirmed the chloroform purchases. Barber Armo described shaving the beard. Trunk dealer Beeger described the canvas trunk purchase and later opening the zinc trunk. Train the porter remembered the heavy load. Witnesses came forward who had seen Brooks on the westbound train. The letter to the acquaintance in Worcester confirmed San Francisco as his destination. Telegraph inquiries to California confirmed a man matching Maxwell's description had stayed briefly at the Palace Hotel. The Palace Hotel clerk, questioned by San Francisco police, checked his records. A guest named T.C. Docquier had occupied room 692 for one night. He'd carried a pistol and dropped an open-faced watch. Under the bureau, investigators found a baggage claim receipt with numbers matching those from Brooks's luggage in St. Louis. The ticket agent at the San Francisco docks confirmed the sale. One steerage passage to Auckland, paid in cash, April 12th. The purchaser matched the description. The ship City of Sydney had already sailed. Detective Chief Burke composed a telegram. The message ran 155 words. It described Brooks in detail: height, weight, build, the freshly shaved face, the clothing, the pistol, the open-faced watch. It named his aliases. It explained the charge. Burke sent it via Western Union from St. Louis to the police department in Auckland, New Zealand, 8,000 miles across the American continent and the Pacific Ocean. The cost? $3.34 per word. Total? $517.70. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat called it the most expensive police message ever sent from a telegraph office in the United States. In 1885 dollars, the sum represented more than a year's wages for most working men. Adjusted for inflation, it would equal roughly $15,000 today. The wire reached Auckland. When the City of Sydney docked in early May, police officers waited on the pier. Brooks was taken into custody as he disembarked. Governor Marmaduke of Missouri obtained extradition papers. President Grover Cleveland signed the warrant May 25th. Brooks hired an attorney with his remaining $125 and fought the order for 77 days before exhausting his legal options. On August 11th, St. Louis detectives James Tracy and George Badger met Brooks in San Francisco. The three men boarded an eastbound train. 5 days later, on August 16th, they arrived at Union Depot in St. Louis. A crowd of 2,000 people waited at the station. An Irish immigrant in the throng reportedly looked at the small, pale Englishman flanked by the two large American detectives and said, "Well, well, to think of it requiring two big men like Tracy and Badger to bring back a little bit of a chap like that." Brooks was taken to a cell in the Four Courts building at 11th and Clark Streets. The grand jury returned an indictment for murder in the first degree. Trial was set for the following spring. Circuit Attorney Clover faced a problem. The physical evidence was strong. Chloroform purchases, trunk sales, flight, the staged body. But Brooks could claim medical accident. A defense attorney would argue that a catheter procedure had gone wrong. that panic in a foreign land had driven the cover-up, that the defendant was guilty only of poor judgment under duress. Clover needed a confession. In late 1885, he arranged for Detective John F. McCullough of the Missouri Pacific Railroad to be placed in Brooks's cell under false charges. McCullough, an experienced investigator, posed as a fellow inmate awaiting trial on unrelated matters. He shared the cell for 47 days. Brooks, isolated and homesick, began to talk. According to McCullough's later testimony, the confession came in pieces. First the outline, then the details, then the motive. Brooks had killed Preller, he said, because Preller refused to pay his passage to Auckland. On account of his meanness, Brooks told McCullough, I decided to fix him. The method? Preller had complained of a private disease, Victorian euphemism for venereal infection or urinary trouble. Brooks offered to help. He injected morphine until Preller passed out, then held a chloroform-saturated cloth over his face until he stopped breathing. McCullough took careful mental notes. He memorized the details. When he was released after 47 days, he reported directly to Circuit Attorney Clover. The trial began in May 1886 at the Four Courts building. The courtroom filled beyond capacity. Reporters took stenographic notes for daily publication. The press printed biographies of the jurors and ran woodcut illustrations of their faces. The prosecution called druggist Fernan, trunk dealer Beeger, barber Armo, porter Train, head waiter Arlington, Professor Ludeking, who had performed the autopsy. A parade of witnesses reconstructed Brooks's movements hour by hour. Then Circuit Attorney Clover called Detective John F. McCullough. Defense Attorney P.W. Fauntleroy objected immediately. The testimony constituted entrapment, he argued. McCullough had been planted under false pretenses. The confession was coerced, unreliable, inadmissible. The judge overruled the objection. McCullough took the stand. He recounted the 47 days. He repeated Brooks's confession in meticulous detail. He described Brooks's anger at Preller's refusal to fund the Auckland trip, the morphine injection, the chloroform-soaked cloth, the methodical staging of the political assassination scene. On cross-examination, Fauntleroy attacked. "Do you think it's right to lie?" he asked. McCullough met his eyes. "We may lie," he said. "When we're working with criminals, we've got to meet them." Brooks, listening, wept. The defense called Brooks to testify on May 26th. He gave his real name, Hugh Mottram Brooks, and his age, 25 years old. He described his education in Stockport and Manchester, his legal training, his incomplete medical studies. He admitted traveling under an assumed name. He could offer no good reason. He denied murder. Preller had complained of a stricture, Brooks testified, a narrowing of the urethra requiring catheterization. Brooks, with his medical training, had offered to perform the procedure. He'd administered chloroform as anesthetic. The dose had been misjudged. Death was accidental. Afterward, Brooks said, he'd panicked. He was a stranger in a strange land. He'd fled in fear rather than face trial for a death he hadn't intended. He admitted placing his own underwear on the naked body for decency's sake. He admitted taking Preller's money. He called McCullough's confession testimony an infamous lie. The defense rested. The case seemed balanced on credibility. Brooks's word against McCullough's, medical accident against premeditated murder. Circuit Attorney Clover requested a delay. On May 30th, Preller's body was exhumed from Bellefontaine Cemetery. A second autopsy was performed under court supervision. The physicians examined the urethra for evidence of catheterization. They checked for stricture, for scarring, for any indication that Brooks's story might be true. They found nothing. No stricture, no catheter trauma, No medical justification for the procedure Brooks claimed to have attempted. The defense collapsed. The case went to the jury on the evening of June 4th. The 12 men deliberated through the night, 14 hours total. At midday on June 5th, they returned to the courtroom. The verdict? Guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence? Death by hanging. Brooks filed a motion for a new trial on June 9th, within the 4-day statutory deadline. On June 17th, he attempted to file a supplemental motion. The deadline had passed. The motion was denied. He appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court. The appeal was denied. In England, his parents received word. Samuel Newton Brooks, a schoolmaster in suburban Manchester, and his wife Hannah Mottram Brooks made arrangements to travel to America. They sailed across the Atlantic, made their way to St. Louis, and presented themselves to Governor Albert Morehouse with a plea for clemency. The British government intervened diplomatically on behalf of a British subject. American prosecutors cited precedent. Britain had recently given short shrift to American citizen Patrick O'Donnell in a similar case. Governor Morehouse declined to interfere with the court's judgment. Hannah Brooks secured a hotel room near the Four Courts building. She visited her son in his cell as often as regulations permitted. She wrote letters to the governor. She attended meetings with attorneys, with clergy, with anyone who might help. The execution was delayed to allow the parents time to arrive from England and to exhaust all legal remedies. Brooks, on death row, converted to Catholicism and was counseled by Reverend J. Henry Tien on August 9, 1888, more than 3 years after the murder. Governor Morehouse rejected the final clemency appeal. A messenger arrived at the hotel where Hannah Brooks waited. "There is news, Mrs. Brooks," the jailer told her, "and it is bad. You had better prepare yourself for the worst." She asked to see her son. In an unusual privilege, she was allowed into the cell for a final embrace. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. No record exists of what they said to each other. August 10th, 1888, dawned clear and warm. The execution was scheduled for morning in the yard behind the Four Courts building. Brooks was to hang alongside Henry Landgraf, convicted of murdering his girlfriend in an unrelated case. 50 police officers formed a cordon to hold back the crowd in the street. Inside the enclosed yard, more than 200 witnesses packed the space. Officials, reporters, physicians, invited observers. Brooks spent the early hours with Reverend Tien. He released a lengthy written statement maintaining the accidental death story, repeating his claim of medical procedure gone wrong and panic-driven flight. At the appointed time, guards brought him from his cell. He walked across the yard to the gallows. A black hood was lifted over his head. His last word was, "Goodbye." The trap dropped. The rope snapped taut. Brooks's neck broke, but the noose cut into his throat, and he writhed for several seconds before going still. The newspapers reported he died hard. Reverend Tien, who witnessed the execution, called it barbarous. Hannah Brooks did not watch. She remained in another part of the building, weeping. Afterward, she spoke briefly to reporters. "I hate this country now," she said. Brooks was buried the same day in Calvary Cemetery, St. Louis's main Catholic burial ground. His father, Samuel, purchased the plot in Section 11. The grave is marked with a simple stone bearing his name and the date. Charles Arthur Preller, lies in an unmarked grave in neighboring Bellefontaine Cemetery, where he was buried after the second autopsy. No family came to claim the body. No stone identifies the location. The Southern Hotel stood at 410 Walnut Street until its demolition decades later. The Four Courts building, where Brooks was tried and executed, has been replaced by a fire station and city garage at 11th and Clark. The letters, described as not fit for publication, were never made public and have not survived. The exact nature of the relationship between Preller and Brooks remains documented only in euphemism. Peculiar, intimate, inseparable, in the Oscar Wilde sense. The telegram, 155 words at $3.34 per word, $517.70 total, was never surpassed as the most expensive police message sent from the United States in the 19th century. It traveled 8,000 miles and brought a killer back across the Pacific to face the consequences of Easter Sunday, 1885, in room 144 of the Southern Hotel.